Hey y'all, thank you for visiting Art with Mackenzie. I am your artist Mackenzie. Today I will be taking you through the process of painting a realistic eye with acrylics. The eye I'm painting is part of my MCU portrait series on 48 by 24 stretched canvases, and this is the eye of the Black Widow. We'll go through my process of how I got from here to here. This is a very specific eye, but the fundamentals are all the same. Eventually, it will fit in with the rest of the portrait. I start off by taking measurements of Black Widow's eye. I do this because all eye shapes are different, and Scarlett Johansson's eye looks nothing like yours or mine. It's hers. When you see them, you know it's her. After I sketch out the main parts of the eye, I like to begin with the reflections on the cornea. I use titanium white. This way I can paint over it and still see through, and it gives me a good background to add a little more color later if I need to. I move on to the white part of the eye called the sclera. We normally see the sclera as white, but in reality it can be a variety of different colors based on the health of the individual. I start painting with a titanium buff. It's slightly yellow in color, and this helps add depth to the eye. For the main body of the sclera, I use titanium white with just a dab of Pans Gray. This gives a bluish hue, and I can adjust the brightness to add volume and depth. Near the reflections on the cornea, I added a little more Pans Gray to begin rounding out the eye. The iris of the eyes adds character to the painting, and here you can have a lot of fun. Scarlett's eyes have a hazel starburst near her pupil with a deep blue ring on the outer edge of her iris, with a greenish field between. The iris is simply a series of tiny muscles that open or close the pupil that allow light in. The iris contains varying amounts of melanin, which gives the iris color. As you paint the eye, keep in mind those muscles radiate from the middle of the pupil outward. You'll want varying levels of light and shadow to give the effect of an actual eye. The more detail you add here, the better off you'll be. The key to realism is detail and contrast. I always apply a base layer of color before adding my detail. This allows me to get some sense of detail color and the direction I'm heading. If I miss any areas of paint while detailing, these colors will show through instead of a white canvas. This is also why I add a basic wash to all of my works for other areas of detailing in the portrait. I'll talk about the importance of washes a little later, but a wash is simply adding water to some paint to thin it out. Now that I have the base colors for the iris and pupil complete, I return to the sclera and start adding some shading and a reflection. The reflections aren't off the eye itself, but rather a small layer of water that keeps the eye hydrated. This means the edges of the reflection don't have to be smooth. I'm using zinc white for the reflection here. Zinc white doesn't have as much pigmentation as titanium white, and this allows for the base colors to show through. I can also layer the zinc white to get the perfect level of reflectivity. Now I return to a combination of Pans Gray and titanium white for the harsher shadow above the reflection. This is the contrast that adds vibrancy to your painting. After defining my edge a little more, I move on to the tear duct and the lacrimal caruncle, which is just a small pink node in the corner of the eye. Knowing the basic biology of what you're painting will help you add the detail that brings your paintings to life. After I get the base colors done for tear duct, I frame out the eye by laying a basic pinkish brown wash over her eyelid because I need to know exactly where her eye ends. This way I can paint over my outlines with confidence. I move back to her iris and fade the blues into her sclera. This works out perfectly with the Pans Gray, but if you're painting a brown eye with a lot of melanin, you'll want to use a lighter brown to get that kind of fade. Notice how her iris and pupil aren't perfect circles. She's looking up and to her left, so the shape is more oblong in nature. Keep fading out the iris. It may look strange up close, but from afar, the way larger paintings are meant to be seen, it adds to the realism and it doesn't look like a cartoon. I like to use the same brush without cleaning it too often. This helps keep my color palette similar for the areas I'm painting. Now, I like to go big and bold with my colors. If they're too bold, I can always tone them down, but that boldness is what adds to the realism. Remember, the two things that add life to any piece of art: contrast and detail. Using bolder colors adds to that contrast. I'm using a picture for reference so I make sure that I'm adding the exact detail of Scarlett's eye. You can have fun with this part and make the eye any color or shade you want, but use the same principles that I'm using here. I'm painting the iris muscles here using different shades of the same color with high contrast. Always keep in mind where your light source is coming from, so your shading and highlights are consistent throughout your piece. Here, the light source is coming from her left. I continue to add the detail from the photo that I'm looking at. Now, I sketched this out. I took measurements to make it precise, and this is the way I want to get it done. And I like the way it turned out. You can do it any way you want. If you want to freehand an eye, freehand an eye. If you want to use a reference photo the way I did, you can do that too. If you want to use trace paper and trace out an eye and then paint it, that's fine too. This is your art. Do it the way you want to make you happy. See, I'm a self-taught artist. I didn't go to school to learn technique, color shading, color blending. The first lesson I learned in painting is to just draw what you see, paint what you see. And that's what I'm doing here. And if you want realism, that's the first lesson you've got to learn. Just paint what you see. While that dries, I move back to the tear duct area and start adding highlight and shadows. Up close, this will look very strange. If you ever study biology, everything looks weird up close. But eyes we see every day, and when you're done painting your eye, your brain will figure it out. I'm adding much darker shading to the top of her eye because her eyelid is casting a shadow on the sclera. Again, I go bold here for more contrast. Then I start in on the detailing. Your eyeball is filled with a viscous fluid and the sclera contains thousands of little blood vessels and conjunctiva. Adding these details can give your eye more character. Scarlett's vessels are a slightly darker shade of blue, and again, I use Pans Gray and Titanium White to get the exact color that I want. Now I go through her sclera and I start painting those tiny blood vessels in a very light blue using that Pans Gray and Titanium White. And if I want to darken it later, I can, or if I like the way it's looking, I just leave it alone. And you can do the same thing. I continue around the different parts of the eye, adding more contrast and detail until I get it exactly right. I'm using a variety of blues, including ultramarine and anthracene for the darker areas. And here I go back to the highlights of her eye again. Now, because the eye isn't perfectly round, the cornea and the sclera have small edges, and those little edges you can see in the detailing at the bottom. And this is where the detailing and the contrast helps bring her eye to life. Burnt umber and red oxide are used for the darker portions of the iris between the Hansa yellow light. When painting your iris muscles, make sure to angle them away from the pupil and toward the edge in a curve. If you paint them in a straight line, your brain will see this and know something is wrong. The eye is one of my favorite parts of a person. They're the first thing you look at when meeting someone new, and, fun fact, even when you're watching a movie and someone is talking, you automatically focus on their eyes first. That's just one of the wonderful behaviors we possess. Why I wanted to paint larger was specifically for the eyes. There is so much detail that can be added if you look closely enough. Now, there are plenty of artists who can paint vividly detailed eyes on smaller mediums, and you can do that too. But I enjoy this larger scale because it lets me really get into the minute details that we miss on smaller portraits. I continue using zinc white for her reflection and layer it gradually until I get the proper opacity. Zinc white is also used to lighten up areas gradually to give the eye a more rounded appearance. I keep going around and adding the two things that add realism, which are, that's right, detail and contrast. It's always a smart idea to slightly darken areas next to reflections to add more contrast without darkening the entire piece. When you're working with pieces this large, it's always a good idea to take a step away and take a look at what you're working with. This will help you identify problem areas that need either, yes, contrast or detail. Even if you get your colors wrong, or if you want to use wild, crazy colors, your art will always be elevated by adding contrast and detail. The tricky part now is figuring out when to quit. Normally, I would have called this eye done, but I've been trying to shoot for that hyper-realism because I just love that look. So keep going until you're amazed by your own work. Don't just walk away when you're happy. When you're amazed, that's when you know you're done. Again, I'm working from a photograph. I need to get the details of Scarlett's eye precise. If I'm off, even just a little bit, the rest of the piece won't look exactly like her, and that's what matters to me for these pieces. And like I said before, I'm using the same brush. This works perfectly for me, but you can use whatever brush you're most comfortable with that will allow you to paint fields of color and add those finest details. Now the tear duct can be tricky. You don't want it to look like a cartoonish pink or a bloody red. I use raw sienna and burnt umber as my primary colors for that happy medium. And to highlight, I use Titan Mars Pale. While I'm in this area of the eye, I do like to add some skin wash around the edges. Again, it helps define exactly where my eye is going to be, and it lets me see how the eye as a whole will look against the color of skin. Trust your brain. You will see if something doesn't look quite right. You may have been noticing that I jump all over the place when painting. That's because of the nature of acrylics. They can dry very easily. Some people get discouraged by this because it can be a challenge sometimes to effectively blend colors. This is why I like using washes. Washes are just small amounts of paint with a lot of water. The amount of water you use will change the opacity of the acrylic. A little bit of water will help keep the paint wet long enough to do your blending. But sometimes you don't want to blend just yet. This is where drying acrylic can actually be an advantage. Skipping to other parts of the painting, let the previous parts dry, so when I return to them, I know when I add a new layer of paint, the underlayer won't immediately blend. This lets me control the palette on the medium, and I get the results that I want. Once you learn how fast your paints dry, you'll be a lot more comfortable using them. So all I'm doing for the next couple of minutes here is going over and adding layers of paint until I get a good facsimile from my reference photo. You know what that means? It's time for some science, y'all! About 550 million years ago, the first multicellular organism evolved a special cell called an eye spot. These cells had photoreceptor proteins that were sensitive to light. These tube-like cells we still have today, and they perform the same function, perceiving amounts of light for our brains to process. And that's all they do, which means they don't see color, just like those first organisms. Those eye spots help those organisms underwater tell the difference between the bottom of the water and the surface. It also helped them see large shadows, which were probably other animals looking for food. This means those organisms that could avoid getting eaten had a better chance of producing offspring. And those offspring could see just slightly better, meaning they wouldn't be eaten either, which meant they'd produce even better offspring. And that's the beauty of evolution, a mutation that allows an organism to not get eaten before offspring can be produced. Then, about 10 million years later, during the Cambrian explosion, eyes began taking on new life. Some of those tube-like cells that receive light evolved into cone-shaped cells. Those cones then allowed animals to see in color. Now animals, namely dinosaurs and small mammals, had evolutionary advantages over animals that could only see in black and white. In this video, we won't go over the science of light. However, the only thing we need to know is that the wavelength of light is how we see color using those special cone-shaped cells. Most animals only have trichromatic vision, meaning we have 3 special cone cells to see millions of different colors in the rainbow. Some people even have tetrachromatic vision, and for these special people, they see even more colors and are even more brilliant. Imagine seeing a sunset with that kind of vision. Are you doing it? Are you imagining a sunset with that kind of vision? Well, you can't. You can't imagine that because you don't have tetrachromatic vision. But boy, that'd be amazing, wouldn't it? Anyway, moving on. When animals started evolving melanin and pigments in their skin, other animals could see them better and produce offspring with even more color. Mutations in plants that created color also helped them survive. So animals that could see in color eat bright fruit that help the plant continue the cycle of life. 500 million years later, our planet is full of beautiful flora and fauna that wouldn't have otherwise existed if our eyes couldn't see in color. I'm going to paint a little more while we dive into the psychobiology of the eye. Those millions of cone and rod-shaped cells line the retina in the back of the eye. The light that passes through the pupil activates those nerves and sends that signal through the optic nerve, also called the second cranial nerve, directly to the back of the brain known as the occipital lobe. That optic nerve is where all animals have a blind spot, but the brilliance of our brains takes information from other parts of the eye and fills in those gaps for us. How does it do this? Because our eyes are connected directly to our brains. Other nerves may be sent to millions of different areas of our brain to help us perceive our surroundings. But our eyes take in and process trillions and trillions of pieces of information every second. And if there were any gaps between seeing danger and processing it, well, let's just say evolution would have made sure we were eaten millions of years ago. So why does any of this matter? I think it truly helps our art overall. Leonardo da Vinci, against the rules of the church, took corpses and performed autopsies on them. He took the skin off bodies to see the muscles that lay underneath. He wanted to know how and why the body looked and worked the way it did. And can anyone argue with the brilliance of a Da Vinci piece of art? Knowing what you're painting is the difference between drawing a couple of circles and calling it an eye, or doing what you're watching here. When I earned my master's in psychology, I never realized how much more I would appreciate the human body. It's exactly that type of appreciation that will elevate your artwork to the next level. Thank you for joining me in the science portion of the video. Let's get back to it. Remember, it's always good to take a step back, or even take a few minutes away from looking at what you're painting. That way when you go back, you can see problems. Here, I noticed a large blood vessel was a little too dark and it was distracting from the rest of the eye. I put a little light wash over it to lighten it up. One thing I like about acrylics, if you don't like something, wait a second and paint over it. Here I'm using paint markers for more fine detailing. You can use them if you want, or don't. It's okay. This is your art. You create any way you want. I use them because the dexterity of my hands isn't that great and I shake a lot with a brush. Once most of her face is nearly completed, I see a few minor details I need to go back and fix. It's always okay to go back and fix your work. It's not complete until you say it is. And fixing these details helps blend her eye in with the rest of her face. And here is the nearly finished piece. As you get closer, you see the brushstrokes, but from afar, it looks like a hyper-realistic eye. Notice all the detail I added, and as you back up, it looks perfect. Well, thanks for joining me, and be sure to follow me on Facebook and Instagram at Art with Mackenzie to see my works in progress. If you like this video or want to see more, leave your comments down below. And be sure to like and subscribe to see the rest of my MCU portrait series and future classes on painting with acrylic.